During the Vietnam War, U.S. military forces employed Agent Orange, a strong pesticide, to eradicate forest cover and crops for North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops. From 1961 through 1971, the United States effort, codenamed Operation Ranch Hand, sprayed more than 20 million gallons of different herbicides across Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The most widely used herbicide was Agent Orange, which contained the lethal toxin dioxin. It was eventually proved to cause substantial health problems among Vietnamese people, as well as returning U.S. troops and their families, including cancer, birth abnormalities, rashes, and severe psychological and neurological difficulties. During the Vietnam War, the United States military engaged in an intensive chemical warfare campaign known as Operation Ranch Hand. From 1961 to 1971, the U.S. military spread a variety of pesticides across more than 4.5 million acres of Vietnam to eliminate the woodland shelter and food crops used by hostile North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. U.S. planes were used to spray herbicide mixes on highways, rivers, canals, rice paddies, and cropland. Crops and water sources needed by South Vietnam's non-combatant local people were also affected during this operation. During the years of Operation Ranch Hand, American soldiers employed more than 20 million gallons of herbicides in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Herbicides were also sprayed near U.S. military sites using trucks and handheld sprayers. During the Vietnam War, some military troops remarked, "Only you can prevent a forest," a play on the U.S. Forest Service's famed firefighting campaign starring Smokey the Bear. The colorful markings on the 55-gallon barrels in which the chemicals were carried and kept identified the different herbicides employed during Operation Ranch Hand. In addition to Agent Orange, the U.S. military utilized Agent Pink, Agent Green, Agent Purple, Agent White, and Agent Blue herbicides. Each of them, made by Monsanto, Dow Chemical, and other businesses, had various chemical additives in variable concentrations. Agent Orange was the most frequently used and most powerful herbicide in Vietnam. It was available in a variety of formulations, including Agent Orange I, Agent Orange II, Agent Orange III, and Super Orange. More than 13 million gallons of Agent Orange were sprayed in Vietnam, accounting for over two-thirds of all herbicides used throughout the Vietnam War. Agent Orange contains substantial levels of 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo P-dioxin, often known as TCDD, a kind of dioxin, in addition to the active chemicals that caused plants to defoliate or lose their leaves. Dioxin was not purposefully added to Agent Orange, rather, dioxin is a byproduct of the herbicide production process. It was discovered at variable amounts in all of the herbicides used in Vietnam. Dioxins are also produced through waste incineration, the combustion of gas, oil, and coal, cigarette smoking, and other manufacturing processes such as bleaching. The dioxin TCDD discovered in Agent Orange is the most harmful of all. Agent Orange, and other herbicides used during the Vietnam War, included dioxin in the form of TCDD, which caused both acute and long-term impacts. Dioxin is an extremely persistent chemical molecule that may be found in soil, lake and river sediments, and the food chain for many years. Dioxin accumulates in the fatty tissue of fish, birds, and other animals. The majority of human exposure comes through foods like as meat, poultry, dairy products, eggs, shellfish, and fish. Dioxin is very harmful even at minute amounts, according to experimental animal studies. It is well acknowledged to be a carcinogen. A cancer-causing agent. Short-term dioxin exposure can cause skin darkening, liver issues, and chloracne, a severe acne-like skin disorder. Dioxin has also been related to type 2 diabetes, immune system malfunction, neurological diseases, muscle dysfunction, hormonal disturbance, and heart disease. Dioxin is very toxic to developing babies and has been related to miscarriages, spina bifida, and other issues with fetal brain and nervous system development. In the United States, concerns about Agent Orange arose after an increasing number of returning Vietnam veterans and their families began to report a variety of ailments, including rashes and other skin irritations, miscarriages, psychological symptoms, type 2 diabetes, birth defects in children, and cancers such as Hodgkin's disease, prostate cancer, and leukemia. When we initiated the herbicide program in the 1960s, we were aware of the potential for damage due to dioxin contamination in the herbicide. Dr. James Clary, an Air Force researcher affiliated with Operation Ranch Hand, wrote to Senator Tom Daschle in 1988. However, given the material was going to be utilized against the enemy, none of us were very concerned. We never contemplated the possibility of our own people becoming involved. A class action lawsuit was brought in 1979 on behalf of 2.4 million veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange while serving in Vietnam. 5 years later, 7 multinational chemical firms that created the herbicide agreed to pay $180 million in compensation to the veterans or their next of kin in an out-of-court deal. Various challenges to the settlement followed, including lawsuits filed by over 300 veterans, until the settlement was approved by the United States Supreme Court in 1988. The payment had escalated to almost $240 million, including interest. By that point, President George H. W. Bush signed the Agent Orange Act into law in 1991, requiring that certain diseases related with Agent Orange and other herbicides, such as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, soft tissue sarcomas, and chloracne, be treated as a result of wartime duty. This helped to standardize the VA's approach to veterans suffering from problems associated to Agent Orange exposure. In addition to the tremendous environmental damage caused by the United States defoliation effort in Vietnam, that country has stated that around 400,000 people were killed or injured as a result of exposure to herbicides like as Agent Orange. Furthermore, Vietnam alleges that 500,000 infants were born with major birth deformities, and that 2 million people are suffering from cancer or other Agent Orange-related illnesses. A group of Vietnamese civilians launched a class action lawsuit in 2004 against more than 30 chemical corporations, including those that compensated with U.S. veterans in 1984. The action, which sought billions of dollars in damages, alleged that Agent Orange and its deadly effects left a legacy of health issues and that its usage violated international law. A federal judge in Brooklyn, New York, dismissed the complaint in March 2005. Another U.S. court denied a final appeal in 2008, infuriating both Vietnamese victims of Operation Ranch Hand and U.S. veterans. According to Fred Wilcox, author of Scorched Earth, Legacies of Chemical Warfare in Vietnam, the U.S. government refuses to compensate Vietnamese victims of chemical warfare because doing so would mean admitting that the U.S. committed war crimes in Vietnam. This would pave the way for litigation costing the government billions of dollars. The conflict of Britain in World War II occurred between Britain's Royal Air Force, RAF, and the Luftwaffe, Nazi Germany's Air Force, and was the first conflict in history fought completely in the air. Pilots and support workers on both sides took to the skies from July 10 to October 31, 1940, battling for control of airspace above Great Britain, Germany, and the English Channel. The powerful, combat-experienced Luftwaffe anticipated to capture Britain quickly, but the RAF proved a hard opposition. Following World War I, the Treaty of Versailles prohibited Germany from having an aviation force. However, with the assistance of the Soviet Union, Germany surreptitiously disobeyed the accord and trained Air Force pilots and support personnel on combat planes. When Adolf Hitler and his Third Reich came to power, Nazi Germany began rebuilding their air force. In February 1935, Hitler established the Luftwaffe, putting former World War I fighter pilot and political friend Hermann Göring in command. By the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the Luftwaffe had become the world's most powerful and well-trained air force. They were critical in Germany's blitzkrieg assault of most of Western Europe, including Poland, Holland, Belgium, and France. From June 22, 1940 until June 22, 1940, the Soviet Union has his sights set on the United Kingdom. He planned a large land and marine assault codenamed Operation Marine Lion, but he realized he had to first beat the RAF. Hitler anticipated that his Luftwaffe and its fearsome reputation would scare Britain into surrendering quietly, and even dangled the idea of a peace pact. However, Hitler miscalculated the fortitude of Britain's people, its military and its feisty new prime leader. Winston Churchill, who rejected the offer outright, Churchill thought that Hitler and the sins of Nazism had to be eradicated at whatever cost. He was aware of the fact that the RAF was Britain's primary defense against German forces crossing the English Channel. Days before France's capitulation, Churchill delivered his famous "finest hour" address to the House of Commons, stating unequivocally that he had no intention of capitulating to Hitler, despite the fact that some members of parliament wished for peace talks. "The Battle of France is over," Churchill remarked in his speech. "I believe the Battle of Britain is about to start." He was certain that the Luftwaffe would launch a devastating attack on Britain, but he was equally certain that the RAF, led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, would hold their own and triumph. Churchill understood that defeat was not an option, and his stirring speech strengthened the spirit and patriotism of the British people, troops, and parliament. Many of Hitler's generals were unprepared to attack Britain. Göring, on the other hand, was certain that his Luftwaffe would soon destroy the RAF with German bombers, preventing, or at least delaying, the necessity for a full-scale invasion. Hitler gave him the green light to show it. The Luftwaffe launched an attack on Britain on July 10, 1940, undertaking reconnaissance missions and attacking coastal fortifications, ports, and radar sites. However, their efforts had little impact on the RAF. The Luftwaffe began assaulting Britain's airfields, air fighter manufacturing sites, and RAF Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes in the air in mid-August, largely employing single-engine Messerschmitt Bf 109 combat fighters. Despite its numerical disadvantage, the RAF replied by hitting Berlin. Enraged, Hitler and Göring altered tactics and ordered the Blitz bombing campaign on London, Liverpool, Coventry, and other key cities, trying to destroy British morale. German bombing was carried out at night to assure large losses and to prevent aerial dogfights between the RAF and the Luftwaffe. On September 15, the Luftwaffe launched 2 huge attacks on London in an attempt to compel the British to negotiate, but they were unable to destroy the RAF or seize control of British airspace. The Luftwaffe was overstretched, disorganized, and unable to meet the need for additional fighter planes or overcome the RAF's superior technology at the time. Hitler put off his planned invasion of Britain at the end of October 1940, and the Battle of Britain came to a conclusion. Both sides incurred massive casualties and aircraft losses. Nonetheless, Britain crippled the Luftwaffe and kept Germany from obtaining air dominance. It was Hitler's first big loss of the war, despite the fact that Britain stood alone against Germany following the fall of France. Approximately a quarter of the RAF pilots who took part in the Battle of Britain were from other nations such as Poland, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, France, the United States, and South Africa. A number of things contributed to the British victory in the Battle of Britain. They were more driven to succeed since they were protecting their native land, and they also understood the local topography better than the invaders. The Dowding system, named for Sir Hugh Dowding, Commander-in-Chief of the RAF Fighting Command, was another important influence. The Dowding system's innovative employment of radar, which could alert the RAF to enemy raids, aircraft, and ground defense provided Great Britain with a competitive edge. The Battle of Britain was a watershed moment in World War II. If the RAF had not successfully repelled the Luftwaffe, Hitler would have likely launched his Operation Sea Lion ground invasion of the British Isles. This would have been disastrous for the British people and all attempts to prevent Hitler from rising to power. Germany needed control of the English Channel in order to attack Britain, and the fight stopped them from obtaining that essential control. Britain's success in the Battle of Britain highlighted the country's military and people's tenacity and perseverance, allowing them to remain free of Nazi domination. It also allowed the Americans to build a base of operations in England in preparation for the invasion of Normandy on D-Day in 1944. The significance of the Battle of Britain was not lost on Hollywood. The Battle of Britain, starring Michael Caine, Christopher Plummer, Robert Shaw, and Laurence Olivier as Commander Hugh Dowding, was released by MGM in 1969. Battle of Britain, a documentary produced by brothers Colin and Ewan McGregor to commemorate the event's 70th anniversary, Voices of the Battle of Britain, a documentary featuring first-hand accounts of RAF veterans, and Mission of Honor, a film about RAF Hurricane Squadron 303.
When two or more countries expand the quantity and quality of their military resources in order to acquire military and political dominance over one another, an arms race ensues. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was likely the most massive and costly arms race in history. Nonetheless, others have happened, often with disastrous effects. Some commentators agree with Sir Edward Grey, Britain's foreign minister at the commencement of World War I, who declared, "The moral is apparent, it is that large weapons lead inexorably to war." With the Industrial Revolution came new armament, notably greatly superior battleships. France and Russia constructed large armies in the late 19th century to counter the growth of British colonialism. In reaction, the United Kingdom strengthened the Royal Navy in order to maintain control of the seas. Britain was able to end its weapons competition with France and Russia through two distinct accords. Yet, Germany had significantly boosted its military budget and capability, constructing a strong fleet to challenge Britain's naval dominance in the aspirations of becoming a world power. In response, Britain enlarged the Royal Navy and built more modern and powerful battle cruisers, such as the 1906 HMS Dreadnought, a technologically advanced kind of battleship that established the standard for naval construction. Not to be outdone, Germany built its own fleet of Dreadnought-class battleships, and the stalemate persisted, with both sides building bigger and better ships in anticipation of a naval attack from the other. Germany, on the other hand, couldn't keep up, and Britain won the so-called Anglo-German arms race. The disagreement did not trigger World War I, but it did contribute to increased distrust and tensions between Germany, the United Kingdom, and other European nations. Following World War I, numerous governments expressed an interest in armaments control. President Woodrow Wilson paved the path by emphasizing it in his famous 1918 14-point address, in which he outlined his vision for post-war peace. The United States, Britain, and Japan signed a convention to restrict weaponry during the Washington Naval Conference, 1921 to 1922, but Japan opted not to extend the accord in the mid-1930s. Moreover, Germany broke the Treaty of Versailles and commenced rearmament. This sparked a new arms race in Europe between Germany, France, and Britain, as well as a Pacific weapons race between Japan and the United States, which lasted until World War II. Although being hesitant partners throughout World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union's friendship deteriorated after Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945. The United States was suspicious of the Soviet Union's goal for world supremacy as it increased its power and influence over Eastern Europe, while the Soviet Union resented America's geopolitical involvement and armaments buildup. To add to the suspicion, the U.S. did not inform the Soviet Union that it planned to launch an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, despite informing them that such a device had been developed. The United States increased its nuclear arsenal to deter Soviet communist expansion. Nevertheless, the Russians launched their own atomic weapon in 1949, launching the Cold War nuclear arms race. In 1952, the United States tested the highly deadly hydrogen superbomb, and the Soviet Union followed suit in 1953. 4 years later, both nations conducted their first intercontinental ballistic missile tests, escalating the weapons race to dangerous new heights. The launch of the first Sputnik satellite by the Soviet Union on October 4, 1957, startled and alarmed the United States and the rest of the world, as it transformed the Cold War armaments race into the space race. President Dwight D. Eisenhower attempted to temper the enthusiasm around the launch's success while pouring federal monies into the United States space program in order to avoid falling behind. The United States successfully launched its first satellite into orbit on January 31, 1958, after a series of accidents and failures, and the space race continued as both countries investigated new technology to develop more powerful weaponry and surveillance systems. Throughout the 1950s, the United States became convinced that the Soviet Union had better missile capability that, if launched, could not be defended against. This theory, known as the missile gap, was eventually disproved by the CIA but not before causing grave concern to U.S. officials. Many politicians used the missile gap as a talking point in the 1960 presidential election. Yet, in fact, U.S. missile power was superior to that of the Soviet Union at the time. Over the next 3 decades, however, both countries grew their arsenals to well over 10,000 warheads. After the failed effort by the John F. Kennedy administration to depose Cuban Premier Fidel Castro in 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev established a covert deal to install Soviet weapons in Cuba to prevent future coup attempts. As U.S. intelligence discovered missile sites being built in Cuba, the U.S. imposed a blockade and demanded that the Soviet Union dismantle the bases and remove any nuclear weapons. The tense Cuban Missile Crisis escalated as Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged letters and made demands. The crisis ended peacefully, but both sides, as well as the American people, had been bracing for nuclear war and began to doubt the necessity for weapons that assured victory. The Cold War ended in 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nonetheless, the United States and the Soviet Union had signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, in 1987 to limit the range and capability of all types of missiles. Subsequent deals, including as the START I Pact in 1991 and the New START Treaty in 2011, attempted to decrease both countries' ballistic weapons capabilities even more. Nevertheless, the U.S. withdrew from the INF Accord in 2019, saying that Russia was not complying. Despite the Cold War between the U.S. and Russia has ended, many contend that the arms race has not. Other nations, such as India and Pakistan, North Korea and South Korea, and Iran and China, have increased their military strength and are either in or about to enter a modern-day arms race. The Communist administration of the German Democratic Republic, GDR, or East Germany, began construction of a barbed wire and concrete anti-fascist Sicherheitswall, or anti-fascist bulwark, between East and West Berlin on August 13, 1961. The Berlin Wall's ostensible aim was to prevent so-called Western fascists from entering East Germany and destroying the socialist state, but it mostly accomplished the goal of preventing mass defections from East to West. The Berlin Wall remained in place until November 9, 1989, when the leader of the East German Communist Party declared that GDR inhabitants might cross the border whenever they chose. The wall was swamped by joyful crowds at night. Some casually crossed into West Berlin, while others armed with hammers and picks began to chip away at the wall itself. The Berlin Wall is still one of the most striking and enduring Cold War icons. As World War II drew to a conclusion in 1945, the destiny of Germany's territory was decided at 2 Allied peace talks in Yalta and Potsdam. They divided the vanquished nation into 4 Allied occupation zones. The East went to the Soviet Union, while the West went to the United States, Great Britain, and, in time, France. Notwithstanding the fact that Berlin was wholly within the Soviet occupation zone, it was roughly 100 miles from the boundary between the Eastern and Western occupation zones. The Yalta and Potsdam Accords divided the city into identical sections. The Soviets occupied the eastern half, while the other Allies occupied the western half. In June 1945, the four-way occupation of Berlin started. The existence of West Berlin, a clearly capitalist metropolis deep within communist East Germany, stuck like a bone in the Soviet throat, as Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev described it. The Russians began planning to push the United States, Britain, and France out of the city for good. A Soviet siege of West Berlin in 1948 intended to starve the Western Allies out of the city. Instead of fleeing, the US and its allies supplied their parts of the city from the air. This initiative, known as the Berlin Airlift, lasted more than a year and delivered more than 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, and other materials to West Berlin. In 1949, the Soviet Union lifted the embargo. Following a decade of relative tranquility, tensions erupted once more in 1958. For the next 3 years, the Soviets blustered and threatened, emboldened by the successful launch of the Sputnik satellite the year before during the space race and embarrassed by the seemingly endless flow of refugees from east to west, nearly 3 million since the end of the blockade, many of them young skilled workers such as doctors, teachers, and engineers. Summits, conferences, and other forms of discussion came and went with no results. Nonetheless, the refugee influx persisted. In June 1961, over 19,000 individuals fled the GDR via Berlin. 30,000 people departed the next month. 16,000 East Germans crossed the border into West Berlin in the first 11 days of August, and 2,400 more followed on August 12, the highest number of defectors ever to leave East Germany in a single day. That night, Premier Khrushchev authorized the East German government to halt the influx of immigrants by permanently sealing its border. In just 2 weeks, the East German army, police, and volunteer construction workers completed the Berlin Wall, a makeshift barbed wire and concrete block wall that separated one side of the city from the other. Prior to the construction of the wall, Berliners on both sides of the city could move around quite freely. They crossed the east-west border to work, shop, and go to the theater and the movies. Passengers were transported back and forth by trains and subway lines. During the construction of the wall, it became impossible to go from east to West Berlin without passing through one of 3 checkpoints: Helmstedt, Checkpoint Alpha in U.S. military nomenclature, Der Linden, Checkpoint Bravo, and Friedrichstrasse, Checkpoint Charlie. In the end, the GDR constructed 12 checkpoints along the wall. East German soldiers checked diplomats and other officials at each checkpoint before allowing them to enter or leave. Unless under exceptional circumstances, East and West passengers, the erection of the Berlin Wall halted the flow of migrants from east to west and helped to defuse the Berlin crisis. Despite his displeasure, President John F. Kennedy admitted that a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. About 2 years after the Berlin Wall was built, John F. Kennedy made one of his most memorable speeches to a throng of over 120,000 assembled outside West Berlin's Municipal Hall, just steps from the Brandenburg Gate. One word from Kennedy's speech stands out in particular: "I am a Berliner." At least 171 individuals were murdered while attempting to climb over, under, or around the Berlin Wall. Escape from East Germany was not impossible. From 1961 to 1989, more than 5,000 East Germans, including 600 border guards, crossed the border by jumping out of windows adjacent to the wall, climbing over barbed wire, flying in hot air balloons, crawling through sewers, and driving at high speeds through unfortified parts of the wall. On November 9, 1989, as the Cold War thawed across Eastern Europe, East Berlin's Communist Party spokesperson proclaimed the shift in his city's ties with the West. Citizens of the GDR were allowed to cross the country's borders beginning at midnight that day, he claimed. East and West Berliners gathered to the wall, yelling "Tor off! Open the gate!" They rushed through the checkpoints at midnight. Almost 2 million East Berliners traveled to West Berlin that weekend to celebrate what one journalist called the largest street party in the history of the globe. Individuals used hammers and picks to knock down sections of the wall, earning them the nickname Mauerspekt, or wall woodpeckers, as cranes and bulldozers removed piece after section. The wall was soon down, and Berlin was unified for the first time since 1945. Only now is the war truly finished, one Berliner spray-painted on a section of the wall. The reunification of East and West Germany became official on October 3, 1990, over a year. The Battle of Iwo Jima was an epic military struggle in early 1945 between U.S. Marines and the Imperial Army of Japan. The island of Iwo Jima, located 750 miles off the coast of Japan, has 3 airfields that might be used as a staging area for an assault of mainland Japan. The island was assaulted by American forces on February 19, 1945. And the subsequent Battle of Iwo Jima lasted 5 weeks. It is thought that all but 200 or so of the 21,000 Japanese men on the island, as well as over 7,000 Marines, were killed in some of the fiercest combat of World War II. However, when the battle ended, the strategic importance of Iwo Jima was put into doubt. According to post-war estimates, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been devastated by prior World War II conflicts in the Pacific to the point that it could no longer protect the Empire's island possessions, including the Marshall Archipelago. Furthermore, Japan's Air Force had lost many of its planes, and those that remained were unable to defend an inner line of fortifications established by the Empire's military authorities. This defense line comprised islands such as Iwo Jima. Given this intelligence, American military officials prepared a brief invasion on the island, believing it would last only a few days. The Japanese, on the other hand, had covertly begun a new defensive strategy, taking use of Iwo Jima's rugged terrain and forests to construct up disguised artillery positions. Although Allied forces led by Americans bombarded Iwo Jima with bombs dropped from the sky and heavy gunfire from ships off the island's coast, the strategy devised by Japanese General Tadamaki Kuribayashi meant that the forces in control suffered little damage and were thus ready to repel the initial attack by the U.S. Marines, led by Holland M. Howland Madsmith. The United States Marine Corps made an amphibious invasion on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, and were greeted with unexpected hurdles. First and foremost, the island's beaches were composed of high dunes of soft, gray volcanic ash, making strong footing and vehicle passing impossible. The Japanese were waiting for the Marines as they staggered forward. The Americans thought that the pre-attack bombardment had been successful in crippling the enemy's fortification on the island. However, Kuribayashi's lack of fast response was all part of his strategy. With the Americans trying to get a tangible and figurative grip on the beaches of Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi's artillery batteries in the highlands above began fire, halting the advancing Marines and suffering severe fatalities. Despite a bombs-eye charge by scores of Japanese soldiers as night approached, the Marines were finally able to press in across the beach and occupy part of one of Iwo Jima's airfields, the invasion's stated aim. Within a few days, 70,000 U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima. Despite outnumbering their Japanese opponents on the island by more than 3-1, many Americans were injured or killed during the 5 weeks of warfare, with some estimates claiming more than 25,000 fatalities, including approximately 7,000 deaths. Meanwhile, the Japanese had suffered significant losses and were running low on supplies, namely weaponry and food. They mounted the majority of their defenses under the cover of night, led by Kuribayashi. While successful, the Japanese soldiers' success seemed to just postpone the inevitable. Only 4 days into the battle, U.S. Marines took Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima's south flank, hoisting an American flag at the peak. Joe Rosenthal, an Associated Press photographer, snapped the iconic shot, which earned him a Pulitzer Prize. The conflict, however, was far from ended. For 4 weeks, battles raged in the northern area of Iwo Jima, with Kurabayashi virtually establishing a fortress in the highlands there. On March 25, 1945, Kurabayashi's soldiers launched their final banzai attack. The American soldiers suffered a number of losses but eventually defeated the offensive. Although the American military claimed the next day that Iwo Jima had been taken, American soldiers spent weeks slogging through the island's jungles, locating and murdering or arresting Japanese holdouts who refused to surrender and chose to fight on. During this time, dozens of Americans were slain. 2 Japanese holdouts remained in the island's caverns, collecting food and supplies until they surrendered in 1949, nearly 4 years after World War II ended. In the end, neither the U.S. Army nor the U.S. Navy were able to use Iwo Jima as a staging place during World War II. Navy Seabees, or construction battalions, rebuilt the airfields for use by Air Force pilots in the event of an emergency landing. Because of the intensity of the combat and the proximity of the assault to the conclusion of World War II, Iwo Jima, and those who died attempting to conquer the island, retain a tremendous lot of significance even today, decades after the fighting has ended. To honor all Marines, the United States Marine Corps dedicated the Marine Corps War Memorial, popularly known as the Iwo Jima Memorial, near Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia in 1954. Rosenthal's now famous shot inspired the monument. Clint Eastwood, an actor, director, released 2 films on the events on Iwo Jima in 2006, Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima. The first displays the combat from the American point of view, while the second represents it from the Japanese point of view. The combat of Okinawa was the final major battle of World War II, and one of the deadliest. On Easter Sunday, April 1, 1945, the Navy's Fifth Fleet and more than 180,000 U.S. Army and Marine Corps forces converged on the Pacific island of Okinawa for a last drive towards Japan. The attack was part of Operation Iceberg, a complicated plot to invade and capture the Ryukyu Islands, including Okinawa. Despite the fact that the Allies won, kamikaze fighters, inclement weather, and heavy battle on land, sea, and air cost many lives on both sides. When American forces arrived in Okinawa, World War II on the European front was coming to a close. Allied and Soviet Union soldiers had freed much of Nazi-occupied Europe and were only a few weeks away from forcing Germany to capitulate unconditionally. However, in the Pacific theater, American soldiers were still methodically capturing Japan's home islands one by one. They set their eyes on the isolated island of Okinawa, their final destination before reaching Japan, after annihilating Japanese forces in the horrific Battle of Iwo Jima. Okinawa's rich greenery, hills, and trees made it the ideal place for the Japanese High Command's last stand to preserve their country. They understood that if Okinawa fell, Japan would follow. The Americans understood that securing Okinawa's airbases was crucial to a successful Japanese invasion. As dawn broke on April 1, morale among American forces was poor as the Fifth Fleet started the heaviest bombardment ever deployed to accompany a troop landing in order to weaken Japanese fortifications. Both soldiers and army leadership expected the beach landings to be a slaughter on par with D-Day. The Fifth Fleet's offensive attack, on the other hand, was nearly meaningless, and landing soldiers could have simply swum to shore. Surprisingly, the predicted mass of awaiting Japanese troops was not present. On D-Day, American forces battled hard for every inch of beachhead along the northern French coast, whereas troops arriving on Okinawa's beaches stormed inland with minimal resistance. Within hours, wave after wave of troops, tanks, ammo, and supplies landed relatively effortlessly. Both the Kadena and Yontan airfields were rapidly seized. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima led Japan's 32nd Army, which had over 130,000 troops. An unknown number of conscripted citizens and unarmed home guards known as Boitai were also part of the military force. As they proceeded further interior, American forces worried when and where they might run across enemy resistance. They had no idea the Japanese Imperial Army had them just where they wanted them. Japanese troops had been told not to fire on the American landing forces, but instead to observe and wait for them, principally at Shuri, a hilly area of southern Okinawa where General Ushijima had established the Shuri defense line, a triangle of defensive positions. American soldiers heading north to the Motabu Peninsula encountered fierce opposition and suffered over 1,000 losses, but won a decisive fight rather soon. It was different along the Shuri line, where they had to assault a succession of highly fortified hills teeming with entrenched Japanese forces. On April 7, Japan's great battleship Yamato was dispatched to conduct a surprise attack on the Fifth Fleet, followed by the annihilation of American forces caught down near the Shuri line. However, Allied submarines saw the Yamato and notified the fleet, prompting a crushing airstrike. The ship was attacked and sunk, killing the majority of its crew. The Americans fought numerous tough skirmishes after clearing a succession of outposts encircling the Shuri line, including clashes on Kakazu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, Horseshoe Ridge, and Half Moon Hill. Torrential rains turned the hills and highways into flooded graveyards for unburied dead. By the time the Americans captured Shuri Castle in late May, both sides had suffered massive casualties. Defeated but not defeated, the Japanese fled to Okinawa's southern shore, where they made their last stand. Japan's most merciless weapon was the kamikaze suicide pilot. The Japanese sent these well-trained pilots against the Fifth Fleet on April 4. Some pilots flew their planes into ships at 500 miles per hour, causing massive damage. American sailors fought hard to fire down the kamikaze planes, but they were frequently outmatched by pilots with nothing to lose. The Fifth Fleet incurred losses during the Battle of Okinawa. 368 damaged ships and 36 sunk ships. 4,900 soldiers were killed or drowned, 4,800 were injured, and 763 planes were lost. The Maeda Escarpment, also known as Hacksaw Ridge, was perched on a 400-foot bluff. On April 26, the Americans launched their assault on the ridge. Both sides were subjected to a grueling combat. Japanese forces hunkered down in a network of caverns and dugouts to protect the escarpment. They were adamant on retaining the ridge and destroyed American platoons until only a few troops remained. The majority of the action was violent hand-to-hand combat. On May 6, the Americans eventually seized Hacksaw Ridge. All Americans who fought on Okinawa were brave, but one guy on the escarpment stood out, Corporal Desmond T. Doss. He was a Seventh-day Adventist Army medic who refused to point a gun at the enemy. Even when his superior commanders ordered him to retreat, he stayed on the escarpment. He walked into the combat alone, surrounded by enemy forces, and rescued 75 of his injured friends. His courageous narrative was adapted for the big screen in 2016 in the film Hacksaw Ridge, for which Doss received a Medal of Honor. Most Japanese troops and Okinawans believed Americans would murder them on the spot if they were caught. As a result, numerous people committed suicide. To persuade them to surrender, General Simon Bolivar Buckner used propaganda warfare, dropping millions of pamphlets stating that Japan had lost the war. Approximately 7,000 Japanese soldiers surrendered, although many chose suicide. Some leaped from steep cliffs, while others were blown up with bombs. When it became clear that any battle would be pointless, General Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Cho, committed ritual suicide on June 22, officially concluding the Battle of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa resulted in massive losses on both sides. Over 49,000 Americans were dead, with another 12,520 injured. On June 18, 2 days before the campaign concluded, General Buckner was killed in combat. Japanese casualties were significantly higher, with around 110,000 Japanese soldiers killed. It is estimated that 40,000 to 150,000 Okinawans were also slain. The Battle of Okinawa is today regarded as one of the bloodiest in human history. The victory at Okinawa brought Allied forces within striking distance of Japan. But, in order to finish the war quickly, and knowing that over 2 million Japanese forces awaited battle-weary American soldiers, President Harry S. Truman opted to launch an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Because Japan would not quickly yield, Truman authorized the bombing of Nagasaki on August 9. Japan has finally had enough. On August 14, 1945, Emperor Hirohito declared Japan's surrender, thereby ending World War II. "19 terrorists affiliated with the Islamic extremist organization Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 aircraft on September 11, 2001, and used them to launch suicide attacks against American objectives. 2 of the aircraft fell into the World Trade Center's Twin Towers in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C., and 1 into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, which claimed over 3,000 lives, led to significant American counterterrorism programs and helped define George W. Bush's administration. An American Airlines Boeing 767 carrying 20,000 gallons of jet fuel smashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City at 8:45 a.m. on September 11, 2001, a clear Tuesday morning. Near the 80th level of the 110-story tower, a huge, smoldering hole was left by the collision, instantaneously killing hundreds of people and trapping hundreds more in upper stories. Television cameras transmitted live footage of what at first glance looked to be a strange event as the evacuation of the tower and its twin got underway. A second Boeing 767, United Airlines Flight 175, then descended from the sky 18 minutes after the first jet struck, made a fast turn toward the World Trade Center, and crashed into the South Tower not far from the 60th level. The collision set off a huge explosion that sent flaming debris onto the streets below and over the nearby buildings. It became evident right away that America was being attacked. The hijackers were Islamic terrorists from Saudi Arabia and several other Arab nations. Reportedly financed by the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization of Saudi fugitive Osama bin Laden, they were allegedly acting in retaliation for America's support of Israel, its involvement in the Persian Gulf War and its continued military presence in the Middle East. Some of the terrorists had lived in the United States for more than a year and had taken flying lessons at American commercial flight schools. Others had slipped into the country in the months before September 11 and acted as the muscle in the operation, at 3 East Coast airports: Logan International Airport in Boston, Dulles International Airport in Washington, D.C., and Newark International Airport in New Jersey. The 19 terrorists had no trouble getting past security with box cutters and knives. They then boarded 4 early morning flights to California, which they did because the aircraft were well fueled for the protracted transcontinental flight. Shortly after departure, the terrorists hijacked the 4 aircraft, grabbed the controls, and turned them into guided missiles. American Airlines Flight 77 flew above downtown Washington, D.C., while millions watched the events in New York, before colliding with the Pentagon's west side at 9:45 a.m. The massive concrete structure housing the U.S. Department of Defense's headquarters suffered a structural collapse as a result of a terrible conflagration brought on by jet fuel from the Boeing 757. At total, 125 military members, civilians, and the 64 passengers on the airplane perished in the Pentagon. The South Tower of the World Trade Center fell in a huge cloud of dust and smoke less than 15 minutes after terrorists attacked the nerve center of the U.S. military, drastically changing the carnage in New York. The skyscraper's structural steel, which was intended to resist winds of more than 200 miles per hour and a sizable conventional fire, was unable to endure the intense heat produced by the burning jet fuel. The Twin Towers North building fell about 10:30 in the morning. When the World Trade Center buildings collapsed, just 6 individuals inside survived. Nearly 10,000 additional people had injuries, many of them serious. Airliner 93. In the meanwhile, United Flight 93, a fourth aircraft with a destination of California, was hijacked about 40 minutes after taking off from Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey. The passengers on board were informed of the events in New York and Washington by mobile phone and airphone calls to the ground since the jet had been delayed in taking off. A group of passengers and flight attendants organized an uprising after learning that the aircraft was not landing at an airport as the hijackers had indicated. Thomas Burnett Jr., one of the travelers, informed his wife over the phone, "I know we're all going to die. There are 3 of us who are going to take action. Honey, I adore you." Todd Beamer, a different passenger, was overheard asking, "Are you guys ready? Let's roll through a free space." Flight attendant Sandy Bradshaw contacted her husband and admitted to sneaking into the galley and filled pitchers with hot water. "Everyone is hurrying to first class," she said to him in her final remarks. "I must leave. Bye." The 4 hijackers were beaten off by the passengers, who were also accused of using a fire extinguisher to attack the cockpit. The aircraft subsequently overturned and descended at a speed of more than 500 miles per hour, falling around 10:10 a.m. in a rural field close to Shanksville in western Pennsylvania. The whole crew of 44 perished. The White House, the U.S. Capitol, Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland, or any of the nuclear power stations along the eastern seaboard have all been suggested as potential targets. The 19 terrorist hijackers on board the 4 airplanes were among the 2,996 fatalities from the 9/11 attacks. In New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C., people from 78 different nationalities lost their lives. After the 2 aircraft collided with the twin buildings of the World Trade Center, 2,763 people perished. 343 firemen and paramedics, 23 New York City police officers, and 37 Port Authority police officers are included in this total. They were working to evacuate the towers and save the office employees who were trapped on upper levels. 189 people died in the Pentagon, including 64 aboard American Airlines Flight 77, the plane that crashed into the structure. 44 persons lost their lives when Flight 93 crash-landed in Pennsylvania. President George W. Bush, who had spent the day being shuttled about the nation due to security concerns and was in Florida at the time of the attacks, arrived back at the White House around 7 p.m. "Terrorist assaults can rock the foundations of our tallest buildings, but they cannot touch the basis of America," he said in a televised speech at 9 o'clock. "These actions fracture steel, but the steel of American determination is unbreakable." He said, "We will not make a distinction between the terrorists who did these actions and those who harbor them, in regard to the inevitable U.S. military response." On October 7, Operation Enduring Freedom, an international initiative spearheaded by the United States and aimed at ousting the Taliban government in Afghanistan and destroying Osama bin Laden's terrorist network there, got underway. The Taliban were essentially driven out of operational control by American forces in less than 2 months, but the conflict went on as American and coalition forces battled a Taliban insurgent campaign centered in Pakistan's border. The architect of the September 11 attacks, Osama bin Laden, eluded capture until May 2, 2011, when American forces eventually located and killed him in a bunker in Abbottabad, Pakistan. It took until August 2021 for all American soldiers to leave Afghanistan after then-President Barack Obama announced the start of a significant military reduction. The Department of Homeland Security was established by the Homeland Security Act of 2002 in response to the security concerns sparked by 9/11 and the mailing of anthrax-laced letters that killed 2 people and sickened 17. On November 25, 2002, President George W. Bush signed it into law. In the modern world, the Department of Homeland Security is a cabinet in charge of border security, immigration and customs, as well as disaster relief and prevention. The National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States was established 2 days after the act. The goal of the politically neutral 9/11 Commission, as it became known, was to look at the circumstances leading up to September 11. On July 22, 2004, the 9/11 Commission report was made public. It referred to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed as the chief architect of the 9/11 attacks, the alleged mastermind of the 9/11 atrocities. From 1999 through 2001, Mohammed was in charge of al-Qaeda's publicity efforts. He was apprehended on March 1, 2003, by the CIA and Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence. He was questioned before being detained at the Guantanamo Bay detention facility alongside 4 other alleged terrorists accused of war crimes linked to the 9/11 attacks. International media attention has been drawn to the use of torture, including waterboarding, during Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's questioning. Mohammed and the other 4 men accused of planning the 9/11 terrorist attacks were given a trial date in August 2019 by a U.S. military judge in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The trial date was later delayed because of the COVID-19 epidemic. The U.S. economy suffered immediately as a result of the 9/11 attacks. During the assaults, several Wall Street institutions were evacuated, including the New York Stock Exchange. The market dropped 684 points, or 7.1%, on the first day of trade after the assaults. In the first 3 months, New York City's economy alone shed 143,000 jobs each month and $2.8 billion in compensation. 60% of lost employment were in the financial and aviation industries, which suffered the worst losses. The damage to the World Trade Center is believed to have cost $60 billion. Cleaning up the trash at Ground Zero cost $750 million. As the buildings burned and fell, thousands of first responders, residents, and workers in Lower Manhattan near Ground Zero were exposed to poisonous gases and debris. 10,000 persons have cancer diagnoses connected to 9/11 by 2018. More than $7 billion in compensation was granted to the 2,680 victims of the 9/11 attacks and their families between 2001 and 2004. When President Barack Obama signed the James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act into law on January 2, 2011, funding was once again authorized. The bill preserved health monitoring and pay for 9/11 first responders and was named for James Zadroga, a New York City police officer who passed away from a respiratory condition he got after pulling people from the wreckage at Ground Zero. The financing for illnesses connected to 9/11 was extended in 2015 for a further 5 years at a cost of $7.4 billion. In December 2020, the Victim Compensation Fund was supposed to stop taking claims. A statute enabling financing for the September 11 Victim Compensation Fund through 2092 was signed by the then-President Trump on July 29, 2019. Previously, once the $7.4 billion fund ran out, administrators had to reduce payouts by up to 70%. Jon Stewart, 9/11 first responder John Feal, and 9/11 responder and former New York Police Department Detective Luis Alvarez, who passed away from cancer 18 days after testifying before Congress, were vocal supporters of the fund. Congress agreed to designate September 11 as Patriot Day on December 18, 2001, to mark the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. The National Day of Service and Remembrance was established by Congress in 2009 on September 11. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, candlelight vigils and floral tributes were held in American embassies all around the world as the first September 11 monuments. At the Buckingham Palace changing of the guard, Queen Elizabeth of Great Britain sung the American song. Billboards in Rio de Janeiro depict the city's Christ the Redeemer monument hugging the skyline of New York City. Two brilliant columns of light were sent into the air from the site of the Twin Towers on the first anniversary of the attacks in New York City in 2002. Afterward, the tribute and light installation was maintained annually by the Municipal Art Society of New York. The beams may be seen from more than 60 miles distant on clear nights. To choose a fitting long-term tribute to the 9/11 victims, a World Trade Center site memorial competition was launched. Reflecting absence, the winning design by Michael Arad is presently located in an 8-acre park outside the museum. Where the Twin Towers previously climbed into the sky, there are now 2 waterfalls and reflecting pools. The 152 bronze panels that surround the pools have the names of all 2,983 victims etched on them, organized according to each person's location on the day of the attacks so that employees and passengers from the same aircraft are remembered together. On September 11, 2011, the webpage was made public to mark the 10th anniversary of 9/11. On the original site of the World Trade Center, the National September 11 Memorial and Museum opened in May 2014. On the original World Trade Center site, the Freedom Tower debuted in November 2014.